So this is a picture of Kamenge, which is a suburb or an area in Burundi that I worked in. I conducted focus groups and semi-structured interviews in the early mid-2000s with ex-combatants of the Burundian Civil War. And many of these ex-combatants were young men who had forcibly been recruited to fight for a rebel group or had joined because there were really no other alternatives in the midst of an organized armed conflict. And then some of them were young women. And now when I was interviewing them, these individuals were between 20 or 22 and their mid-30s. And they had really been at the heart of the civil conflict, but were really trying to rebuild their lives through civic organizations, as community peace builders, working on a whole range of issues around justice, around reintegration and disarmament, and also around economic development.
Thank you, Angela. Very interesting. Hello, my name is Henrik Alfsson. I'm a communications officer at the Nordic Africa Institute. And sitting here next to me is Angela Muvumba Sellström, who is a senior researcher at the Nordic Africa Institute. And welcome to today's Science to Policy conversation. You've just heard Angela describe the neighborhood of Kamenge. And for those of you who are following us through the audio version, I'll give a little bit of a closer description. So this is a densely populated Bandoville, as they say in French, or shanty town, where in Burundi's capital, Bujumbura. And with its sprawling settlement of improvised houses, Kamenge embodies what the Rwandan-Burundian novelist Scholastique Mukasonga calls les interminables quartiers de terre et de tôle, the endless neighborhoods of earth and corrugated metal. So it's in these neighborhoods that Angela has met and interviewed ex-combatants and other informants, people with self-lived experiences of war and sexual violence. And we'll come back to these people later because their stories and their testimonies are in many ways connected to today's topic, which is the UN Resolution 1325 and its aim to push for gender equality in war and peace. So moving to the first question, Angela. You've studied the achievements and shortcomings of UN Resolution 1325. And together with Dijke Mørle, who is not here, your former research assistant here at NAI, you have written this policy note, mobilizing new voices for gender equality in war and peace. And could you describe to our listeners who are maybe not so familiar with this topic, just briefly, what is the Women, Peace and Security Agenda?
So the Women, Peace and Security Agenda, otherwise called WPS, is a set of what I would call, and others have called actually, sort of a legislative framework on gender issues in the UN Security Council. And it all started with the passing of Resolution 1325, 25 years ago. So we're now at the 25th year marker. It's been a quarter of a century since that resolution was passed. And in the time since then, there have been 10 resolutions that form this legislative framework. And really what the legislative framework does with these different resolutions is it creates obligations on member states of the Security Council in the ways in which they promote and protect and address international peace and security. And it really has kind of resulted in three big shifts. So the first shift is that it has raised awareness about the importance of including women in peace processes, that women should not be an afterthought and that they should be included, both in kind of high-level negotiations, but also in their involvement at the local level and how they can kind of influence the ways in which wars are conducted and ended. The second is that it's promoted accountability, not by itself, but the WPS agenda has been ushering in an era of accountability for sexual violence. You know, before this era, we didn't really believe. There were normative reasons. There was a Geneva Conventions. There were other legal considerations, but it was not as widely practiced in diplomacy to try to castigate and prevent sexual violence, and also to treat sexual violence as a serious war crime. So there's been accountability introduced into the system. And then lastly, it's made gender a viable analytical tool, so that now UN practitioners or individuals working with a program, an initiative in Burundi or in Liberia or in any other part of the world have to account for gender. How do their programs affect women and men differently? How many women are receiving particular benefits? How many men? How are those differences accounted for? And what are the consequences of that? So gender is now considered to be much more of an analytical tool than it was before 1325 and the WPS agenda.
Thank you, Angela, for giving us that background. So now let's dive into the core of your analysis and your main conclusions. So in the policy note, you argue, and I quote, "The inclusion of different gender perspectives increases the chances of durable peace." How so?
Oh, that's a wonderful question. It's a great question. We try in this policy note to kind of capture the state of art of research. And some of this research is going back 20 years or longer. We now know through really systematic research of all kinds, not by myself alone, of course. There's a whole bunch of researchers globally who have worked on these issues that shows that gender has a kind of important correlation or association with more gender equality in particular has a correlation or association with peace, in the sense that societies that are more gender equal are less likely to have systematic tendencies to commit or to permit human rights violence domestically, and also to engage in organized armed conflict internationally. It doesn't mean that these states are not having a defense system or not, militarized in other ways. It's not a panacea, gender equality, but it has an important association with alternative forms of addressing disputes, conflict, and meeting needs of a nation state and of a society. I think that's partly related to the fact that with gender equality, there are more women involved in the running of a country, in taking decisions in all manner of ways, but also that there are more men who are sensitive to and made aware. And I think gender equality also frees men in other really important ways to be caregivers and caretakers, to take into account larger societal issues. They're not just limited to militarized roles.
Thank you. So you emphasize that for the WPS agenda to succeed, it needs to move beyond the usual suspects. Mm-hmm. Who are they? Okay,
the usual suspects are people like myself. They're experts. WPS is a bit of a paradox. It's an agenda that's been passed by nation states in the UN, and particularly important when states are in the Security Council to promote WPS. That doesn't mean that gender equality work doesn't happen elsewhere in the UN system. It does. But on on the level of security, there is a kind of focus on the role of states. And that often translates into a focus on policies, on norms, on legal obligations of states, on a lot of pieces of paper. essentially. And what that means is that technocrats, academic experts, policymakers who are very familiar with WPS, they spend a lot of time, we spend a lot of time talking to one another. And I think that that creates a problem, because this is an agenda that really should belong to all people. So rather than affecting a few thousand people or a couple of 100,000 people, or limiting it to an aspect of work that just is really governed by the activities of advocates, those who already believe in it, it needs to be an agenda that really touches the lives of millions of people, and millions of people have to be engaged in it.
So let's go to these new voices that you would like to see engaged. So which are these actors, and how and which practical measures can be done to make them engaged in the WPS agenda?
One of the things that always has struck me is that when I was doing my first years, when I was doing research on the WPS agenda, I remember, I think I was doing fieldwork in Rwanda with women's organizations. And I mentioned this to somebody, what I was doing, and they said, "What is that, the WPS agenda?" And now when I go back and I ask people who belong to church groups or local authorities working at a city level, or at in a rural clinic, and they're doctors and nurses, or other kinds of people who have influence, so traditional leaders, all of these people don't know what the WPS agenda is. And I actually think that's a problem. I think it's a problem because politicians will not promote gender equality if it's not demanded from below. So it needs to be owned and demanded from below. And so these folks who are practicing, teachers, who are priests and imams, who are passing on values to their local communities, who are delivering basic services in clinics, they need to be part of the conversation about WPS. And they need to, therefore, not only be made aware of it, but also relate it to their own daily work. And in that way, kind of, I hope, would build a constituency and a demand for gender equality that is really coming from below, and therefore will influence politicians and promote the implementation of WPS.
Thank you, Angela. Very interesting this, but time is running, so we have to get to the end. But before we wrap up, I'd like to go back to where we started, to Kamenge, the suburb of Bujumbura. So the ex-combatants and your informants that you've interviewed there, how will they be affected by the success or failure of UN Resolution 1325?
I think we can think about them, these friends and colleagues of mine, and people who really helped influence my thinking, in both in the concrete and the abstract. In the abstract, I don't believe that it's possible to retroactively prevent them to have gone into war. I think the WPS agenda, it has a pillar for recovery and relief and rebuilding society. So I think that having them be part of and have access to resources through the WPS agenda would be very useful, for they would be able to help rebuild their societies. And I'm really thinking here even of the men, and now they're men, now they're fathers, and some of them grandfathers. Then I think kind of much more about the future of their families, you know, and whether or not they will then be pulled into another war. And I think having a better implementation of WPS, spending the next 25 years on really building a constituency from below, will be in the long run beneficial to their children and to their grandchildren.
Thank you, Angela. Thank you for joining the conversation and sharing your valuable insights from your research. And before we end, I'd like to turn to our listeners and viewers to just say that the policy note we've been discussing is this one. It's called Mobilizing New Voices for Gender Equality in War and Peace, and is authored by Angela Muvumba Sellström and Daike Möller. And the NI Policy Notes series is a series of short publications where we boil down our research into a compact format, easily accessible and available for and tailored for policymakers. And you can find this and our other policy notes on our website, www.nai.se. Thank you for listening.